we're going to backtrack a little bit. Again, Karen Feiner, I teach at the University of Oklahoma. I also have a podcast called The Shakespearean Shrew, which follows all things Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. So if you haven't started listening, please do. It's a lot of fun. I talk to a lot of actors and directors. Hello. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to tell you tonight is also in those podcasts. So back to the 11th century. So Macbeth is from 11th century Scotland, as I'm sure some of us already are aware. And the play starts in 1040 with Macbeth's, I said it already. Gonna have to take a drink later. With the M's, or the Red King as he was known, his killing of Duncan. Now, he was not killed in bed, Duncan. He was also not an old man when he was killed. He was 39 years old, killed on a battlefield. And so already we're seeing that the history has dramatically started to shift. Also, Shakespeare took 17 years of action and put it into 1 year in the time of the play and 2 hours in terms of the play from curtain up to curtain down. So Game of Thrones, if anybody's seen Game of Thrones, he went and put it into 2 hours. So basically what we have is a Macbeth.
You can say it because we are working indeed on this production. It's not bad luck, I promise.
It's so hard not to say it. So he marries Lady M. Now, before you think he's a great guy, because they have a great relationship, how did he marry Lady M? Well, he killed her husband and 50 of his men by lighting them all on fire in a hall. And so, you know, the good and the bad. So he reigned for 17 years after that, with Ruach, his wife, that was her name, by his side. She actually did have a kid. So when we're sitting there going, is she barren? Is she not barren? She did have a kid. And then 17 years after, that is when the Red King was killed by who? Malcolm, right? That's true, right? He was killed by Malcolm, but not at Dunsinane. He actually was killed 3 years later, but he did lose that battle. So for some reason, Shakespeare chose that place as the place that Macbeth was going to die. I think it's because it's much more poetic than the name of the actual place. So that's one layer of Macbeth. The second layer comes in the 16th and 17th century. So now we've got King James, who was the infant king of Scotland, and he then took over in England in 1603 after Queen Elizabeth died. And they didn't really like that. And so they expected him to really embrace Roman Catholicism. He didn't really do that because he was trying to maintain the status quo. And so we came to 1605, where, remember the 5th of November? Does that ring any bells to people? What was that poem about? Anybody remember? Remember, the 5th of November. Yes! The gunpowder, yes! The gunpowder treason and plot. So basically that whole aspect was, hey, we're gonna remember this moment because it was the moment that they tried to kill King James, his entire family, and Parliament. They were gonna blow up the House of Lords, right? So they were found out. Now, something to keep in mind is equivocation. In this play, the word equivocation comes up multiple times. So I want you to listen for it, because it is a reference to Father Garnet, who was a priest who was a big part of that conspiracy. And what he said when they accused him was, you can't prove it. I didn't do it. But he also wrote a book on a treatise of equivalencies, where it said, don't do anything that they can prove. And so his ending was not a happy one. Drawn, quartered, his head put on the top of London Tower. So it didn't have a happy ending. But Shakespeare used that in this play. We see so much of that in this play, where it's, hey guys, don't kill the king. It's a bad idea. This is what happens if you kill the king. Because then bloodshed begets bloodshed. And that is Macbeth, right? That is Macbeth as a whole. So as we are looking at the play, look at the cycles of violence that start to emerge. The bloodshed that begets bloodshed. So the other shout out to King James, other than the Scottish play, is the witches. In this play, it's the witch, but he wrote the book on witches, literally. In 1597, he published a book called Demonology, which was all about witches and that realm. And so, again, King James is saying, hey, right place for me. Be my kingsmen, I will give you money. And Shakespeare is saying, thank you very much. Here's a play just for you. And so those are some of the things that you can start to see unravel and layer up in this play if you're paying attention, if you're looking closely at the dialogue, at the actions of the actors, even the location itself. So that's one of the reasons I love Macbeth, is because you just see the layers of history that exist. And that takes us to the 17th century. Once we get past that, things get a little fuzzy for me. So I'm going to pass the buck and send it over to David.
Sure. So thank you for having me. My name is David Davis. I'm the chief curator at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. So I'm really happy to be here, and what a fantastic collaboration this has been. So connections. It's so interesting when you look at moments in time and how similar human behavior can really be. When it comes to violence, you see a lot of the violence in this particular Shakespearean play, and when you think about the West, the Wild West, you think about the same kind of thing. But what's really interesting is when you start to juxtapose real history with the mythology of the West, the true American identity about what the cowboy is, when you start to get into the film and all of that kind of thing. Which, by the way, if you ever visit our museum, please come visit our museum. There's a lot of that, and we really get into those really cool things. But when they approached me about how could this play be set in the West, and where, and what would it be like, it's really cool because I think that this story is almost naturally a Western in a lot of ways. It's really cool that it's that way. And I think that when we see this go down, when we see this show happen, it's going to be very organic. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit was the time period that this is set. So they chose very wisely to set it here in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is very, it's different. Its origins are very different from a lot of the other Western states. It's very tumultuous. There's a lot of conflict, and there's a lot of coalescence between people. And it all starts with the idea of Indian Territory. And the Indian Territory is, talk about layers. There's a lot of historical layers to what that is. Interestingly enough, Indian Territory was never really a territory. It was not a federally recognized territory. That was just a name. But as we all know, this was the area past the Mississippi where a lot of the southeastern, eastern, even some of the northern Native American tribes were removed as the United States, as Anglo-Americans, and the westward expansion of the country started to happen. Settlement started just pushing and pushing and pushing further west. The original idea of an Indian territory was actually much bigger than what Oklahoma is. It was actually not Texas, but it was Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and even parts of Iowa. And so the original thought of what an Indian territory might be actually came as early as President Adams, and then later with Jackson, where the thought was we give them their own state or their own territory west of the Mississippi, and all of the whites for the United States would live east of the Mississippi. But then, of course, you see how that changed and changed and changed until all of those areas where even the civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminoles, they were forcibly removed. However, their areas that they were given continued to shrink. And then as things changed, federal regulations changed, lobbying happened. You get what's called the Dawes Act, and the Dawes Act decided to change it to where there wasn't sovereign territories. There were basically allotments for individual people. And so it basically privatized everything for the Native Americans living there. And then strategically, it ended up with opened areas. And that's what led to the land runs that, created the state, honestly, because the land runs opened it up to white settlement. There were 5 of them, actually. And the setting for this play today was what we normally call the Cherokee Strip, but that's actually a misnomer. It was actually the Cherokee Outlet. The Cherokee Outlet run of 1893 happened. It was the largest of our land runs, and it was actually the most chaotic. It was the most problematic. There were actually murders that happened because there was a lack of federal government, being there to register people. There was a lot of confusion. So anyway, it was a very tumultuous time. But the other really cool thing about not the chaotic part, that's not cool. But what I mean is, what's interesting about our setting here is that it was a progressive time. It was a big time of privatization of land, which is very similar to the time period that we're talking about with Shakespeare. That's an interesting parallel there. So you have a distinct change in the cattle industry, and the cattle industry was king in the West. And of course, that's what our museum is all about. So we tell that origin of the cowboy and the origin of what that meant, and cattle herding and all of those things. It goes back to Spanish colonial times. It goes back to, Columbus brings the first cattle in 1490 to Hispaniola. The earliest Texas cattle drives were in the late 1830s, early 1840s. It wasn't what you thought. They were going either west to California or east to Louisiana, to New Orleans, to the port. But where in our setting, it's the Great Western Cattle Trail that went right up through the Cherokee Outlet. That one, as a matter of fact, is about to celebrate its 140th birthday. And so we have a special exhibit coming this fall that you can come see that tells all the whole history about that particular cattle trail and its significance. But so the setting being in the Cherokee Outlet, and in our main character being a cowboy on a ranch, in a privatized ranch, it was a time where this whole system had just changed. It's very different than those open cattle drives up the trails. This was a private ranch after the run, and at that point there were railheads, for the trains, and there were new breakthroughs in fencing. And so if you could imagine, this ranch was an individual ranch that was fenced in by this owner's individual structure of fencing that identified them, and then they branded their cattle to identify them even further. So great story. I don't know how I can go deeper and deeper, but I think that's probably
Cool, yeah. So we're gonna jump into some questions really quick. I have a few for them, and if any of y'all have any questions, feel free to have a little thing, and I'll come to y'all and see what you have to say, okay? Wonderful. So thank y'all for that so much. Something that I've been thinking about is perspective, right? And so, because land and power kind of go hand in hand and throughout time, right? So can y'all talk a little bit about these respective time periods, about how the average man might perceive these people in power and how they might interact with each other, and what was that relationship like?
That's a great question. Actually, when you first said what you were going to talk about tonight, I was like, oh, in England, they had these things called commons, which was the common land that people could use. So you could gather food from there, you could gather wood from there, you could graze animals on that. It was open to the common person. And then those in power started enclosing those spaces and restricting them. And so many people who were, making it by living off of the land went into extreme poverty. It destroyed what they were able to do in order to get by. So they did not have a great relationship with the powers that be, because the powers that be were like, well, this is our land. As soon as we put a fence around it, we own it. You can't be on it. And it was devastating.
I think you could find a parallel with the Native American experience, traveling west, because they had their ancestral lands, but then as westward migration of the United States continued, and it was kind of the same thing where the lords of the land kind of lay claim to it, and then they are kind of reduced to. But interestingly enough, it's almost the opposite when you think of the privatization of land here in the United States at that time, because that was really the spread of the country, and then it was the chance for people to start anew and get land. And that's why you had people showing up in droves to these land runs to try to get their own piece of property to make something of themselves. And if you get a moment before you leave tonight and you look at some of those images out there, there are a few of the Cherokee Outlet Run. Here's what's really interesting. There's one that shows the train in the background. The trains had just been brought into that, before the run happened. There were people showing up on the Atchison Topeka line. They actually rode the train into that run, and you could see them in that photograph getting out of those cars to actually make the run right at that time. The train was scheduled to show up, and then they all made it, trying to make something of themselves. Of course, I mentioned the chaos earlier, but those images are absolutely amazing, and it's a point in history that we have recorded that we can actually see, which kind of gives it a lot of mystique. So.
And so with that, I'm also curious about within a ranch as well, kind of what was that relationship between the owner versus the people who he was hiring as ranch hands?
Well, I mean, it's all about land ownership, right? So the ranch owner was someone that would have made a claim, during the run. They were the ones that owned the land, and then to run the cattle herds, they had to hire out people, and and it took, for the cattle drives back before all of this happened, those open range cattle drives, it actually took more people, and you're talking about 3,000 some odd head of cattle that was pushed from northern Texas up into Kansas. I mean, it's kind of amazing if you think about it. These ranches were much smaller, so you're talking about probably fewer head. And really, honestly, if you think about western Oklahoma and the grazing land, on 160 some odd acres, you wouldn't have gotten that many head of cattle. However, some of the bigger ranchers started to purchase off other allotments or other state claims. And so those ranches grew. And then, of course, from what I've read, a lot of those ranches really started becoming more like corporations. So they were private investors from back east that were purchasing up this land and then starting a ranch and then hiring the crew in. So you would have had basically a ranch boss, and then you would have had a crew. It became very corporate, not what you think, and not what you really see in movies. So.
Do any of y'all have questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to just say, I'm just intrigued with this. You mentioned the Doors Act, which created the allotment system. Ironically, the relationship between the first Americans and Washington was really a form of internal colonialism. And the interesting thing I'll throw out to you is the same thing that happened in the allotment, the end of common territory. The British practiced that in Myanmar, Burma. Identical thing. They took land which was held in common by the Burmese, and it ended up that all the land was given to the Chinese money lenders who knew the monetary system. So it goes back even beyond that.
Interesting.
And I just throw it out to you because my own work, I find that so many aspects of colonial policy practiced overseas certainly apply to the U.S.
Absolutely.
Bureau of Indian Affairs, beyond.
Absolutely. Even when you get into the history and the origins of even cattle herding, you know, and the because that origin goes all the way back to the earliest Spanish colonial holdings in Mexico and southern Texas. So it's interesting the heritage, so to speak, of colonialism is found everywhere.
And the encomienda system in the Philippines.
Yeah, very interesting.
That's a wonderful comment. Thank you. I think that's an even deeper discussion that we could get into, but I don't believe we have time for it. But I think that's a wonderful thing to bring up. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Karen.
Yeah.
What do we know about the historical record of Macbeth in Shakespeare's time versus how it's evolved now? A lot of what Shakespeare wrote, from what I remember from my college class, a lot of it was received for stuff that was sort of around. He just knew these stories. The Romeo and Juliet, there were lots of different versions of that sort of story and different themes on it that he had received, that he would sort of know and then developed into like. And so what I'm wondering is how much do we know what he would historically know about?
So actually, that's a great question. He actually got his recountings of Macbeth mostly from Holinshed's 16th century historical text about Scotland, the history of Scotland and England. So that's primarily where it came from, which is, again, interesting because it's our first mention of Banquo. And in that one, it actually says Banquo was with Macbeth when he killed Duncan. So that whole idea of Banquo as this innocent figure that we all love and adore, we're like, oh, where did he get that? But King James said that he was related to Banquo. So I think Shakespeare had a moment of, yeah, probably shouldn't have the person related to the king kill a king. We're going to skip that part. So it's a really interesting connection of how he took pieces of history, blended them, and then kind of blurred the lines of time and space to make it all fit onto a stage. That's a great question.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, so according to the Homestead Act, you could claim 160 acres. However, a lot of them, if they knew that, or there would be a lot of incorporated groups of people that would plan a town as well. And so what you would do is you would stake your claim with the flags, and then a lot of them would end up selling off sections of them to creating town plots, basically. So that would happen a lot, but mostly it was a 160 acre plot. There's one really great image out there on the little interpretive panel that is literally a photo, and this is the Cherokee Outlet, by the way, that run, of a horse and someone's claim flag. That actually exists, which is absolutely amazing that exists. But so it was not an easy process, because not only did you make it down there with your family and everything that you had basically to start over, and then you survive the run from whatever starting point you went from. You got to somewhere where you actually made a claim and you did your stakes. You actually had to make an instant improvement on the land and then go to the nearest temporary land office and then register. Here's the really interesting thing about the Cherokee Outlet run, and this is what I keep saying chaotic. This is what made it chaotic to me, was the fact that on this one, for some reason, the federal government required you to get a certificate of registration before you even made the run. And we actually have a photo of a group of people waiting to do that before that happened, before the run happened. So the thing that they didn't do is they didn't give enough offices and federal people to do that. And they didn't have enough policing of anything. The actual only police presence that was there was the U.S. cavalry. And famously, the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were acting as police in the Indian Territory for a long time. So anyway, a lot of these people, they were faking those pre-registration certificates, and there were even murders that had happened over this kind of thing. And then, get this, if someone survived the pre-registration, survived the run, staked their claim, went back to the land office to do their actual registration, there were so few offices, the lines ran for miles. And if you can imagine, 1893, and there were people that literally died of dehydration in the line waiting to get to the land office. That's what I've read in several different books. That's really interesting and chaotic. So
I did not know that. That's wild. Does anybody else?
That really makes me rethink like car registration now. I'm like, oh, that line doesn't feel so
you can
bad.
do it online now. You don't have to go to the tag agency.
All right, we have time for one more. Awesome. Well, I do have a question for you, David. I'm so curious to know how it was working on a project like this and helping me set up this lobby display out here versus anything that you do for the museum that is your typical day-to-day.
So it was fantastic. It's like setting up an exhibit. I mean, it's basically a mini exhibit out there. That's what we love to do. As a museum, we tell the story of the Trans-Mississippi West, especially the iconic Cowboy, what Western heritage is. There's a lot of facets to our story. As a museum, we're always looking for collaborations like this to meld two things together. This older literature and this older history with this part of our American history and our shared experience that I'm sure a lot of us here, are here in Oklahoma because of that earlier history. I think that it ties us more directly to this amazing story that is a part of our shared human heritage. It's that significant. So I think this is wonderful, and this is the type of collaboration that our museum absolutely loves, and hope we can do more of this in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. Yay! Awesome. You guys have a little bit of time before the show starts, so feel free to get up, stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. There will be a panel post-show with the actors led by